Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Jarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate the support from every single one of you guys on the recent content. We have a bunch of interesting topics lined up. And before we get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
A lot went on in the NBA. Actually, we had a decent amount in the last couple hours before we met to record, right? So we'll start with the All-Star reserves, right? So in the West, you have Luka, Shea, LeBron, Durant, Jokic, right? In the East, Embiid, Giannis, Tatum, right? And then also Lillard, right? But now we also have the reserves to add on
Yes, sir.
to the list as well, right? So we'll start off, I guess, in the Western Conference, right? So in the West, they mentioned, a number of names, right? Kawhi Leonard, right? Anthony Davis, Karl Anthony Towns, Steph, Paul George, Anthony Edwards, Devin Booker. And then in the East, right, you had Jaylen Brown, Bam, Julius Randle, and Paolo, as well as Donovan Mitchell, Maxey, and Brunson. Um, so obviously, right, when we last discussed these, right, you know, um, we had a decent chunk of like guys that we thought either were or were not going to get in, right? Obviously things change back and forth, right? I don't remember. I don't think I had Booker on my All-Star list, and I think at the time, right, that was like right before he went on that stretch where he was scoring like 40, 50, 60,
Yeah.
over the stretch of a few games. I don't think either of us had Randall
No.
on our Eastern ballot at all. And then, of course, I think we both had Trey Young, right? And then he was a guy that ended up not getting picked, right? With the Kings, right in the West, neither De'Aaron Fox nor Sabonis were picked, right? So the Kings had a couple guys off the list, right? With the Pelicans, you didn't have Ingram. So, I mean, I guess, if we're first going to, discuss, the list, what were kind of your thoughts? I mean, I feel like most of it was about what we expected. I know that there were definitely a few, snubs, and some of them will probably still get in, right? Because, as we're going to be talking about in a moment, right? We have some injuries that we're also going to have to discuss. But, what were your thoughts, on this list?
Yeah, this list was interesting. I think there were a couple of snubs. And some guys maybe who don't really deserve to be on here. I think Karl Anthony Towns over some other guys is kind of questionable for the West. I think Sabonis definitely is a guy that should have been in there, or at least De'Aaron Fox. One of the two guys should have been in there, and it's like because they're playing at an elite level. But I do understand with the Minnesota Timberwolves and their record as it is. You do want to have one of the top teams in the West have multiple All-Stars if they're that good. So I do get that to an extent, but at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how I feel about Karl Towns being there. And then in the
Mm-hmm.
East, obviously, Trey Young is definitely a big one. That one hurts for sure because it's like, I mean, what more does a guy have to really do? His situation
Right.
isn't that great, but his numbers are stellar in my opinion. Maybe
Yeah.
not, the best in terms of efficiency and from the field, but
Yeah.
the
Right.
assists and the scoring as well. So it's like, I mean, what more does a guy have to do? Although, Paolo is very deserving. I think maybe I would
Mm-hmm.
probably sub out Randall, but the Knicks have been on a insane tear, so you can't really hate on that too much. But definitely, Trey Young is a huge snub for sure. I think those are probably the top
Right.
two snubs.
Yeah. I mean, again, when you think about it, it is interesting with Young, right? Where it's like, we've seen, there are other guys that are all-stars on this list that are having good individual seasons and their teams are not great. And then, for him, right, obviously his team, doesn't have the greatest record either, right? It's worse than some of those teams, but you're like, you should still be probably on there just because. Um, Obviously the reserve is voting is different, right? Because with reserves, it's the coaches that put guys in, whereas like with the starters, it's the 50% fans,
Right.
25% media, 25% players. Um, so yeah, I mean, but like you look at Randall's numbers, and honestly, he had played pretty well, right? You look at the Knicks. They have only lost a couple of games, I think 2, 3 games since January, right? Which is really impressive considering, we obviously really liked the trade for the Knicks, but I think they've been even better probably than we would have expected. Um, and then, with Paolo, I think both of us had him on our all-star ballots as well, or reserves as well, right? And
Yeah.
obviously with the Magic, the record isn't great, right? They're still around 500 or whatever. But he's had a very good season. So I think, yeah, Trey Young obviously is a name, but I think, as we get into it, right, we have some injuries, right, that we're going to have to discuss, right, where that's going to probably get some of those guys in that we think probably should get in. In the East, right, obviously we have, I guess we don't really have any West injuries yet, knock on wood, but in the East, right, Julius Randle, right, he, on that Rivals Week game we talked about, right, he dislocated his shoulder, and he's going to be out for at least 2 to 3 weeks, right,
Hmm.
which could mean he might be out longer. We don't know. But obviously, that puts him out of the All-Star game, so that means he's going to have a replacement. I don't quite remember if they do it where it's like if a front court guy is out, we automatically replace him with a front court guy, or vice versa. I don't really remember. I don't think that's the case. But I know that there were guys in the past that were injury replacements, right? Like LaMelo Ball was one, DeJounte Murray was one, but I can't quite remember if they replaced guys that were, that played the same position. I don't think
Right.
so. So it could be a scenario where, like, yeah, Randall's out, but Trey Young is in. Um, and that obviously impacts the Knicks, right, in some ways, right? Because again, he's one of their best players. And he's a guy, that, is a part of the identity of the team. Not the same from a defensive standpoint, but just a physical, tough guy, that can play downhill and kind of bully guys. So, his presence will be missed. They've still been able to win some of these games without him. But with the Knicks, regardless, like I said, it's been impressive what they've been able to do. With the deal, because again, we talked about it. We liked it for both teams because with the Raptors, it gave them a sense of direction. Like, yeah, it's time to rebuild. And then we obviously liked it for the Knicks because we thought from a talent perspective and from a fit perspective, Anunoby's just a better talent slash fit, with the Knicks guys. And we talked about, right, like if you're trying to figure out who you'd rather have on your team, it probably would be Anunoby, in comparison to Barrett, and Quickly, right? If you're trying to like, go to the next level in terms of like get to like that contender tier. Not that
Right.
those guys are bad players, but just in the concept of team basketball, you
For
might
sure.
prefer, yeah. So, but in terms of your thoughts, right, for the Randall injury, right, you think this will impact the Knicks? I mean, I think it does, but like just in general, I think it kind of depends also how long he's out
Yeah,
too.
absolutely. I think, as much as like I've hated on Julius Randle and his tenure on the Knicks, you can't take away the fact that he does win them games for sure, and he does contribute a lot. It's just in the playoffs is where I tend to kind of really come down hard on the Knicks. But in the
Right.
regular season, I don't really hate on Randall too much.
Mhm.
So I think it's going to be a huge loss for them because like I said, they've been on a tear, post Anunoby trade. So it would be intriguing to see, what their offense really is going to look like without him. I don't think Anunoby and Jalen Brunson is going to be enough. I'm sure they'll win a decent amount of games, a decent chunk of games, because Jalen Brunson has been playing out of his mind as well. But that coupled with Anunoby, I don't think that's going to be enough to get them over a hump. So I think we'll probably see them drop a couple of places in the standings potentially. But I think it's going to be a huge loss for them.
Yeah. And I think now we're going to be moving on into another right injury, and this one is also a very significant one. In fact, this may be the most significant one.
For
Actually,
sure.
it is in the NBA, and that's Joel Embiid, right? And this was one of those other things, right, that we were informed of, a couple hours before we started recording, was that Joel Embiid. The wording's a little bit different according to a couple of sources, right? So, like Shams put out that Embiid has a torn meniscus, whereas Woj and Chris Haynes said that it's a meniscus injury. So but either way, that's bad, right? So obviously that's your best player, right? That's the guy who is, I would say at this point probably the favorite to win MVP.
For sure.
Right. Obviously he had taken, a beating from a significant number of people in the media, right? Because they claimed that he was, kind of sitting out and kind of ducking, avoiding, the Jokic battle or whatever, right? Obviously, they also got fined earlier today because again, he was a late scratch, and like the type of late scratch where like nobody knew what was going on.
It was
So that's
15
not
minutes before the game.
exactly right. Which usually, like I believe, a half hour is what you have to do, right? I think it's a half hour before the game is like
Hmm.
the latest you can like say like okay, this guy is either playing or not playing, right? So, but either way, right, this is a significant injury, right? Because we saw, Embiid had missed a few games prior. He played against the Sixers, or excuse me, he played against the Warriors, and didn't look very good. Probably shouldn't have played, right? I think he left the bench like a couple of times, right? Because I think towards the end of the first half or first quarter or whatever, I think it was Draymond, right? Who like fell on him or whatever, and then he hurt his knee, so then he had to leave for a little bit, and then he came back. And then right at the end of the game, I think it was Kaminga, right, that fell on him or
Yeah.
dove in him or whatever.
Yeah.
Not intentionally, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like,
On a loose ball.
um, yeah, on a loose ball, right? And so then, he had to come out again, right? And then when they said they needed an MRI, that's obviously that's never a good sign, because that suggests that there's something going wrong enough, right, check, to check out what's up. And so, that's pretty bad, right? Because obviously the Sixers now they've been on a slide as of late, right? Where they're I think they've lost 4 or 5 in a row, right? They've been on this long road trip and they've lost every game, including, even the ones that Embiid played in. So they have another one tonight, right, as we're recording, but we'll see. But regardless, right now they are no longer, right, that great in the standings, right? Because I think one of the last times we recorded, right, they were like,
They were
I think
third.
like 3.
They were
They were
third.
third.
Yep.
And now they've dropped to 5, right? And it's very possible if they lose, a few more games, they could kind of separate themselves, right? Because I think Indiana has 4 more losses. So, unless they go on like a 10-game winning streak, they're probably going to stay, in that spot. Although we'll
Right.
see. It kind of depends on who else was out because they've had stretches where like everybody was out. Where like against the Nuggets, like every starter was out. So if some of those guys come back, they may be able to win a handful of them to kind of stay afloat. Like if they can stay around 500, that's obviously very difficult to do when your best player is out. But this obviously, like I said, is a big deal because again, it's different than like, okay, Embiid's only out for a couple of games and then he'll be back. Like we don't know how long he'll be out, right? Because they already said that they're going to have to see um, you know, and weigh all these options before they decide, right? Like, because obviously the surgery hasn't happened yet, so they're probably trying to avoid the surgery. But either way, regardless, right? Like, I would imagine it's probably not gonna. He's probably not gonna be able to play through it, right? Like, I'm gonna
No.
assume he's gonna have to sit out, um, at least for a little bit. I mean, I could be wrong, right? Because I think he had some type of meniscus injury, I think a couple postseasons ago, right? It might have been the one post bubble, right? I think it was the one that they lost to the Hawks in, and he was playing like with a like a meniscus injury or
Yeah.
whatever. So
Seems
I
like
don't
he always
know.
has a brace on. So I
Right.
think he's been
Yeah. So
battling
I
it
don't.
his entire career.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's going to be that type of situation, or if it's just going to be a situation where he's going to have to sit out. But if he's out for a significant amount of time, that's going to drastically impact the Sixers because again, ideally you'd like to be a top 4 seed so you can have home court advantage at least in
Sure.
the first round. And if you were the 3 seed, you'd have that, and I mean you would have it if you're the 4 seed, but they're the 5 seed right now. So, and these other teams around them, they've been playing pretty well. So, I mean, the Cavs, they've been on a tear, right? They're like 9-1 in their last 10.
Yes, sir.
Um, I mean, I guess the Pacers have slowed down a little bit, but now Halliburton's back, so we'll see, if he can kind of ramp things up. And then the Knicks obviously have been on a tear, albeit, they're going to be without Randall. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, how do you feel like this is going to impact the Sixers? Because, I mean, this is pretty significant, and this may be a scenario where, like, that might push them to try to, like, acquire some more help at the deadline, maybe more so than they were expecting. But, yeah, so what do you think?
Yeah, this is a heartbreaker for the Sixers. I think everybody who's a fan of Embiid really also
Yeah.
it's a really big blow. I think unexpected. Definitely nothing you can really do about it. I've heard some very interesting reports about it. I think it was from the New York Post. They said that Joel Embiid played through this injury due to scrutiny. So that's something
Mhm.
that I kind of wanted to touch on before I get into like how
Yeah.
it impacts Philly. It is kind of interesting because I feel like it's really a lose-lose situation for the guy. If he sits, he's pretty much ducking. That's what people are going to say. But then if he's playing, and playing through an injury, it's okay. Yeah, he wants to win MVP. So, it really is a lose-lose. But I think when you are in situations like that, that means you're pretty much doing everything right because you're the best in your field. So you're going to be facing a lot of scrutiny. Just wanted to console Philly fans and Embiid fans out there. But in terms of what this is going to do for Philly, I think this is more in line with what I thought Philly was going to be at the beginning of the season and even before the season started. I didn't think Philly was going to be a top 3 seed or anything like that. I thought they would be more of a middle of the pack team. And that seems like what the trajectory is going to be because I don't think, like you said, Embiid is going to be playing through this injury. I think he's probably going to have to miss a significant amount of time, especially leading up to the playoffs. I'm not going to say season-ending injury,
Right.
especially with
Right.
how technology in the medical field has improved over the last few years. But I think this is something that we're probably going to see Embiid be sidelined for a decent chunk of time, and that's
Right.
not good. So, like you said, I think this is going to put the pressure on Philly to go out there and acquire some real help, like some legit stars to really help bolster up this roster. Because I think without Embiid, you're going to be really stuck in a rut. Because I think their backup big is Paul Reed. So,
Yeah.
that's not the greatest replacement. He's more of a four in my opinion. So I don't think that's sustainable, and I think that would potentially put them in a huge hole. And I think like you said, you've got climbers. Indiana, I think, is going to be on the rise. Cleveland's going to continue to win. New York is probably going to fall, but I think we might be looking at Philly falling to 6 or 7, and I don't think that's where they want to be ideally, especially considering how the season has gone so far with Embiid. So, like I said, it's just a huge blow, but I definitely would
Yeah.
look for them to be using their assets, and thank God they do have assets so they can actually potentially save the season.
Right. Yeah. Because like you said, just a tough situation to be in, right? For everybody involved. Because again, like I mean, this is something that's that's plagued him, for like you said, a decent chunk of his career. I mean, again, the first 2 seasons of his career, right, were mired by injuries because he didn't play at all. And to his credit, he's gotten better every year. Both in terms of like his skill level, right, and his conditioning, right? Because again,
Absolutely.
he had even when he was first on the floor, right, he had more problems missing games earlier in his career, and now he's playing more. He has a much heavier workload than he did right as a younger player. So it's a tough situation, like you said, to be in. So that's where I think, like, again, that doesn't mean you want to do anything stupid. It doesn't mean, right, that you want to make like a panic trade, and then, like acquire somebody, right, that's probably still not going to help you,
Right.
in the long run, because that's kind of the danger. And that's kind of, what can be scary, right, about these type of situations is you just never know. I don't really expect, the Sixers to make a panic trade because I just don't, we don't normally see Daryl Morey do that kind of stuff. I guess, you could make the argument that that Westbrook deal, right, that I think he made, his last year in Houston, maybe that was kind of like a panic trade because it felt like Chris Paul was getting close to being done at that point.
Right.
So, we'll see. But either way, we already knew they were going to be active. It may just push them to be a little more active, but
Yeah.
we don't know because again, we've in terms of the trade deadline stuff, just in general, we've heard you know so much about a lot of the teams that have pieces that teams might want, right, are asking for the moon right now, and obviously that can change, right, because we have a week to go. And obviously the closer you get to the deadline, the closer that we might get to teams trying to do something or anything. So we'll see. But yeah, this is definitely tough. And it was I didn't, like when I saw it at the end of the game, right? Obviously I knew that it wasn't great. Right? Obviously it was like at the end of the game, so you
Yeah.
kind of assume like, yeah, he probably wasn't going to finish it anyways, and the game was basically over. But again, right after the game, they were like, yeah, he needs an MRI. So that was where, you know, that's rough. But obviously then you have the injury replacement, for the All-Star game because again, I'm expecting that he's not going to be there
Yeah.
for the All-Star game because I don't think, you would put him in a situation and I don't think he would do that, right?
No.
Where
No.
it's
No. No.
like, oh, I'm going to come back and play in the All-Star game. I don't expect that at all.
Yeah.
So I think Trey Young is obviously, one of the next guys up, to get the nod. But who would the next guy be?
That's a good question. I have no clue, honestly, because this would be
Yeah.
for the East.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I know a
I
lot of
mean,
people have been vying for Porzingis, but I don't think so. Um, I really don't know who it would be. But
right.
before we talk about the All-Star thing, I did want to bring up one more thing. And it's
Hmm.
related to the MVP and the award stuff because
Yeah.
you have to hit that minimum. What is it?
Oh, yeah.
65 games,
65.
right? So
Yeah.
what's your take
Just hit
on
on
that?
that.
What's your take on that? Do you think that's like obviously, I don't think Embiid's probably going to play 65 games this season. So that's
Right.
the unfortunate thing.
Yeah.
But I've seen a lot of stuff even on like NBA Tip Off on TNT. They were talking about it. So
Right.
what are your thoughts on it? Are you more on the side of is 65 games? Is that a good amount of games? Is that
I
is that
mean
fair to you or not?
I mean, going into the season, my thought process was like, hey, 65 games, that's relatively fine. Just because, like, in general, they don't normally give the MVP, to guys who miss like, 17 plus games.
Sure.
Just, that was normally what they did in general, right? It was like, I guess you could say an unwritten rule.
Hmm.
Um, I guess the thing that's kind of tough, right, is that like, for a lot of the players, who have critiqued it as of late, the problem is right, like they chose, they voted on this. So right, this was a mutual agreement between the Players Association, and the owners and everything. So
Hmm.
that's kind of the tough spot. I mean, I think where it may get a little bit tough because I know the TNT guys they mentioned like say for Embiid, right, where it's like, yeah, he may not win MVP, but he should still be able to be like on All NBA, and that's probably the tough part where it's like, yeah, that you can make the case for that, right? Like obviously, if you miss like 20 plus games, you shouldn't probably be All NBA,
Right.
first team, but you could be like third or second or whatever.
Sure.
Um, and that's the tough part, right? Because now, obviously, if he misses more time, then guess what? He's not going to be on an All NBA team at all. And I don't think this impacts him because he already got his contract, right? But
Yeah.
for some other guys, who need to be on All NBA, in order to get, in order to get that next deal, that next supermax deal, that will impact them. So that's where, yeah, you could make the case to maybe tweak it. But I'd say the games played is probably about fine. I mean, maybe
Okay.
if you wanted to up it to 70, you could. But I think more importantly, I think that part where it's like, yeah, it shouldn't necessarily completely impact your ability to make all NBA because that part's tough, right? Because you could have a scenario where a guy plays like 64 games and puts up crazy stats, but because he had that one missed game,
Yeah.
right? He's off all NBA completely, and there goes his money. There goes, whatever.
Right.
So, but in terms of the 65 game limit, yeah, I'm honestly okay with that. And I think, again, like we've seen as a whole, more guys have played games or have attempted to not just sit out games more so this season, right? With multiple guys, right? Like
Hmm.
LeBron and AD have played a ton, right? Kawhi and Paul George, have played a ton of games, right? All these other and other guys that, typically miss a decent amount of time. So that's the tough part where, yeah, I mean, injuries can happen, and that's the thing that sucks, right? Because it's like you can't always account, for stuff like that. But at the same time, personally, I'm feel like I'm relatively okay with the 65 game limit because I also just don't feel like, yeah, you probably still shouldn't be rewarded for playing like 50 games. And
Right.
like in some ways, you could make the case it might give some guys a little bit of an advantage, right? If not like if they're sitting out games and then they're only like choosing to play certain games. Not that he was doing it, but
Right.
like,
I
for
get
other
you.
guys, we've known in the past, right? Like some guys will sit out or whatever, and then play for certain games, and that can provide some advantages. But I think, yeah, overall, I know that sounds kind of like a rambling statement, but yeah, I would say I'm cool with the 65 games. But the one tweak I would make, yeah, is you should still probably be able to qualify for All NBA, but just probably not like the major awards like MVP or Defensive Player of the Year. And that's the tough part for Embiid, right? Because again, he probably would win it, if he was able to, if this was like, a regular season where that's not the factor, but he's not going to win it, and somebody else will. But that wouldn't be the first time that that's happened though, um in a situation like that, right? Because I think that happened to him, right, like a few seasons ago, right, where I think like people made the case that he should have won it, then he missed like too many games towards the end,
Yep.
so then it was Jokic, and then actually at the same time there were other guys, right, who missed a significant amount of time that would have gotten it over those two,
Yep.
right? Because I think that was the year after the bubble, right? Because like I think say like the Lakers, right? They were like the 1 or 2 seed for most of the early part of the season before AD and LeBron got hurt, and
Hmm.
like either one of those guys could have won it, if they had played enough games, and then obviously someone else, could have gotten it as well. So like that's gonna happen every year. It
Yeah.
just sucks that it happens in this, in this way, right? Because again, like it's one thing if guys miss like stretches of games here and there because of like little nagging injuries, but a meniscus, that's a serious tough one, and that's a rough one to like lose a major award or something, because of something like that that just kind of came up out of nowhere, just bad luck,
Yeah.
right?
And
Because I
yeah.
think because he didn't have the meniscus injury, I don't think going into this, right? I didn't think it was knee soreness, but I guess at the thing that happened at the end of the game exacerbated it.
Yeah. That's what they're saying. Like it kind of made it worse. The fact that he wasn't, fully healthy, um, originally going into the game, and then coming to
Right.
falling on his knee.
Yeah.
Also Draymond as well. So that just
Yeah.
didn't help. Getting bruised and battered like that. But like
Right.
when we talk about MVP, I feel like there is a certain criteria that
Yeah.
isn't necessarily established, but I feel like health definitely should play a factor into being the most valuable player in the league. Because I think if you're healthy and you're also putting up insane and amazing numbers to help your team win. I think all three of those factors, should go
Right.
hand in hand into winning MVP. So unfortunately, I think Embiid is a scratch for the
Right.
award at this point, and it sucks because, like you were saying, when you're putting up all these amazing numbers and then an injury that's pretty much out of your control happens, what can you really do? So I definitely agree with you on the All NBA part and the MVP part as well. So unfortunately,
Yeah.
it is what it is. It's an injury.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, that's just, that's tough. I mean,
Yeah.
just
I didn't think it
just
was a
in
dirty
general.
play either. I know a lot of people were
Yeah,
trying to
no,
say that it was.
I
I
don't
don't
think.
think so.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, it's obviously frustrating, when stuff like that happens
Right.
because again, like, who expects, like, something like that to happen, right? But like, at the same time, in basketball, it is a contact sport, right? Guys will dive on the floor for loose balls. We've seen times in the past, right, where like, yeah, they were kind of intentional, right? Like the
Yeah.
Beverly one, to Westbrook, but I don't think it was that, right? Because Kaminga also like normally like usually like people usually kind of look at guys with a track record, right? Like,
Like
say with a
Zaza,
Draymond.
Pachulia, Draymond,
Yeah,
guys like that.
exactly.
Known dirty
And so, like,
players.
right, and say even with a guy like a Draymond, right, because he has that history, even if he didn't necessarily actually do something that's like a dirty play, you automatically assume it, right? Because in your mind, right, like you're like, oh yeah, we've seen this guy, do that kind of stuff
Right.
before.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's rough. So I
Yeah.
don't really know what else to say about that one other than, hopefully he's able to return sooner than later and, help the Sixers get to where they want to go. Because that's the main thing, right? Obviously he's, hopefully that's all we can hope for is that he can stay healthy and that it's not a scenario where he has to miss the rest of the season, right? Because we've seen scenarios for other guys, right? I think it was Lonzo, right, where his season was done after he tore his meniscus. And then, for other guys, they've been able to come back, like at a certain point in the season. So, um, I don't know. So,
Yeah. I think, but back to this whole snubbing thing. I know that was the
yeah,
original point. Sorry, I didn't mean to
right.
go on a tangent, everyone. But
Mhm,
to back to the snubbing point, I definitely would say
mhm,
I think I gotta go with Porzingis, man. I think I'm
yeah.
going with Porzingis.
I mean, I guess. I mean, because again, that's the thought process. Where I'm like, really, who else? Can you really, feel like you feel great about putting in there, right? Because it's like, you look at, all the standings and, the teams, in the Eastern Conference, right? I mean, like, Butler, I mean, he's missed a decent amount of time, and I don't think this was one of his better seasons. So
Yeah.
maybe he might get the nod because he's, like an established all-star type guy.
Hmm.
Maybe. But then after that, right, like I don't think any of the other Pacers would get it. Like, I mean, like, is Siakam gonna get it?
No.
Probably not. Um, I mean, for the Bucks, none of their other guys are going to get it because they already have two. And then for everyone else, right? The Bulls, no. The Nets, no. I mean, like, is
Yeah.
anybody on Detroit going to get it? No, I don't
No.
think so. So
Nobody in
yeah, so
Washington, nobody in Charlotte. Like
right,
that's what I'm saying.
but
It's got
yeah,
to be Porzingis, man.
right. But now I think it is kind of interesting, like when you look at the East and you look at the standings, where it's like, wow, because the Sixers are 5, right, and then the Bucks are 2, and I guess now we can, obviously it's way too early to really say much, but obviously, like in terms of the Bucks, how have you felt about them, since Doc Rivers, has coached? Obviously, he's coached, 2 games, right? I think it was one against the Nuggets and another one against the Portland Trailblazers. But then other than that, right, because they had a couple other games, I think, where he was not he like he had already been hired, but he wasn't coaching, right? They had
Right.
like a bad loss to the Cavs. They had a win against the Cavs, and I think maybe some other game. But
Yeah.
as the head coach, he's 0-2. One against the Nuggets, so not really much of a shame in that. And then another one where it was a pretty bad loss to the Blazers.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the same stuff, right? And that's where obviously it's an early start. So there's not really a whole lot you can say. But it's kind of interesting where it's like I feel like again, we know that he's an upgrade, I guess, over the other guy, but at the same time, it's this the roster issues are what they are, where it's like, you watch that Nuggets game and it wasn't really Jokic that was, like destroying them and taking them apart. Although he played relatively well, it was Jamal Murray, right, where he had like just stretches where he couldn't, be stopped. And then with the Blazers, right, similar thing, right? It was like Anthony Simons, Scoot had stretches, right? Malcolm Brogdon. So again, it's like it's the same problems that we've already talked about before. And that doesn't change, I don't think, with the coaching, right? It's not like the scores have been crazy where they're giving up like 140, 50 points, but it's still the same issues of like, yeah, like they have some weird stuff where like, yeah, they just can't seem to get any stops, relatively consistently. And that's where we both said, like, yeah, he's an upgrade. So you do the hire anyways for sure, but you still need, those defensive upgrades at certain positions. Like you can just see it, right?
Yeah.
Because again, like, you know, you're gonna have to go through stretches in the playoffs where you're gonna have to guard some high level guards, right? Like, um, with the Sixers, right? If they play them, you'll have to put somebody on Tyrese Maxey, for a 7 game series, right? And that's not going to be fun. And
Yeah.
that's Tyrese Maxey. There are other guards, that are a little bit better, right? Like say like a Jalen Brunson. The
Halliburton.
Celtics guard, yeah, Halliburton. The Celtics guards are good. They're not in the same sphere as those guys, but they're still good. And then in the West, right? Again, we've already talked about it, right? You got to have somebody guard Jamal Murray, you got to have somebody guard, Booker or Beal. I mean, like, and they don't
Yeah.
have those type of guys. Even at the wings, they don't really have. So, I mean, like, just in general, it hasn't changed my perception of them. It doesn't mean that I don't think they can win the title. It's just I still lean into the thought process of they need defensive reinforcements.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And it all goes back to what we were saying when they first hired him. It's like, all right, cool. You brought in Doc Rivers, great coaching mind. Cool. But Doc Rivers does not make Damian Lillard and Malik Beasley lockdown defenders. That's just not how it
Right.
works. And that goes for any team. Like, if you have cones on defense, they're not going to automatically become perimeter all stars
Right.
defensively. Like, even like with D'Lo. Remember, he was talking about, yeah, I'm going to be, like
Derek
Derek
White.
White. Right,
Yeah.
and what happened? He's still the same old D'Lo on defense. So
Right.
nothing
Yeah.
really has changed, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
Maybe, hopefully, we'll see some schematic changes from Doc Rivers,
Right.
but there's only so much a scheme can do if you don't have the personnel. All goes back to
Yeah.
what we were saying when he was initially hired, and this is like
Mhm.
it all factors into what I was saying from the jump at the beginning of this season. I was like, the Bucks I think are frauds. Like, it wouldn't really surprise me if they go out in the
Mhm.
first round because they get torched by a guy who has like an amazing series, but he's not like,
Mhm.
one of those S tier players, especially at the guard
Right.
position, because I think the guard
Mhm.
position is where they're really getting hurt defensively.
Right.
Because I don't really have a
Mhm.
problem with Giannis's defense. I don't really have a problem with
Oh,
Lopez's defense as well. Although Lopez looks like he's lost a step a little bit, he's still, he's getting a little older. That's all it is. So
yeah.
can't really hate on
Right.
that too much. But oh yeah. I don't know. And like you were saying, 0-2 start, it's bad. Scoot is starting to look like an NBA player. So
Mhm.
that looks really good. I saw the game last night.
Right.
That was intriguing to
Yep.
watch. They pretty
Yeah.
much spoiled Dame's homecoming, which was
Mhm.
surprising. I don't think a lot of people expected Portland to win that game the
Yeah.
way that they did.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the Bucks, they've got to turn something around. I know, like you were
Mhm.
saying, it's very early. He's 0-2 as the head coach, but
Yeah.
yeah, defensively they still don't have it, and
And
that's where
again,
the deadline stuff is going to come into
right.
play, hopefully for them.
Yeah, and again, just to kind of also touch on this thing because this is another thing that has just come in, right? Like you look at the standings, right? In the Bucks, it's not like they're 5, 6. It's not like they're 5, 6 games ahead of the other teams around them, right? Like the Knicks, they were, as we were talking, right? They were down to Indiana for most of the game. They came back and they look like they're about to steal it. They're gonna be like a half game behind the Bucks.
Right.
Now the Bucks have the tiebreaker, right? Because they beat they beat the Knicks, what, like 2, 3 times or whatever.
Hmm.
I think the Knicks won once, and I think the Bucks won 2 or 3 times.
Sure.
Um, but either way, like that can make a difference, right? And that could, like you said, that could make the difference between you playing one team in the first round that's like a 7 seed versus playing the 6 seed. And there is a difference between the top 6 seeds in the East and then the 7 and behind. So that's
Absolutely.
like again, because you're not quite the Celtics where it's like they're about to drop, this game to LA somehow. Um, but like you can afford, not that you want to lose, but like you can afford to lose a game like that if you're the Celtics because you're still a decent, amount of games ahead of everybody else.
Sure.
But you can't drop a game to the Blazers if you're the Bucks because you're right there with, the rest of the pack. So,
You got to win all your must wins. Like, that's just how good
right,
teams operate, and that's why I'm
right.
saying, like, they're fraudulent in my opinion.
Yeah,
Still.
and that's kind of, and I guess, before we get into like our, news and rumors or whatnot, are you starting to feel a little bit down about like, the teams in the Eastern Conference? Not that like they can't win the title, but that, it's starting to feel like, maybe they might be, a little bit worse, I guess, than, like maybe the top. Because like I know like the Celtics, are 37-11, soon to be 37-12 after this loss to the Lakers. But like, we saw them play against the Nuggets and the Clippers, right? I think those are the two best teams in the West. I know the Thunder and the Timberwolves, right, are the 2 and 1 seed or whatever. But I think the Nuggets and the Clippers are better. But that's just me, at least right now.
Sure.
But like, they lost to the Nuggets, and they got destroyed by the Clippers. I think Porzingis didn't play in that game. And then the Bucks, they haven't played the Clippers yet, but they did lose, to Denver. And again, it's a regular season game. So there's not but so many takeaways you can always have from a regular season game because we've seen teams pummel teams in the regular season and then come playoff time, it doesn't matter, right? A 1 game or 2 game sample size doesn't mean much. But like do you feel like the teams at the top of the West will still probably like beat, the who comes out of the East? Or, are you of the mindset that like it could be like 50-50? Because I
Uh,
don't know. Because like I said, because I think Boston has played the best basketball this season in the NBA. And again, like they've only lost 12 games, so it's not like you're whining or complaining about anything. But then it's like when you've seen, they've had a couple of games against some other teams, and it's kind of, against some of the better teams, and it's kind of interesting, right? Like they lost to Minnesota, they lost to Denver. Have they played Oklahoma City? Yeah, they did, and
yeah,
Oklahoma City won, right?
yeah,
Yeah, Oklahoma City won. They got destroyed. I know they beat the Bucks in that first matchup, but then in that second matchup, they got destroyed so badly. I mean, all the subs got pulled out by halftime. Um, and so I don't know. Like, and again, still a lot of time, and it's not like there's any panic about the Eastern Conference teams' records. And obviously, the trade deadlines can make a huge impact, or a decent impact on some of these teams, right? Because it's not like the Celtics can trade for a superstar, but then like say the Celtics or the Bucks, they acquire guys that they need or types of players that they need. Then like it may not matter. But what do you think?
yeah,
Just kind of like just something to talk about because it's just something I've noticed. As of late, and it could just be it's January, February. January, February is a very strange time in the NBA because some teams, like the Celtics, that have really good records, sometimes will just take their foot off the gas, as we saw tonight against LA. And then like, and then some of these other teams, right, like, that have given up that are bad, right? Like, sometimes they'll have like these weird games where like, hey, all of a sudden, like, the other team is kind of like, yeah, so we'll try, this one game because we think we can win. So
yeah. I think I pretty much agree with everything you said. There's times where Boston looks like the best team in the NBA. And then there's times when they play against some real competition, and then you don't feel too good about them. And I think that's kind of been the story of most teams in the East for the past couple of years, in my opinion. So I don't know. I think when it comes to the West, I think there is a clear talent gap. I think there's
mhm.
um, a clear disparity in terms of what's going on in the league for sure. Because I think if you look at Minnesota, OKC, the Clippers, and Denver, I don't think Boston could really beat either of those teams in a 7 game series at this point. So I feel like if Boston does go to the finals, I don't think they would come out winning. You know what I mean? So like and that's no like knock on them or anything, but I just feel like personnel wise, there are times when the other teams in the West, they look like they kind of gel together a little bit better. And I
Mhm.
guess with Denver, it would be more of an experience kind of thing. With the Clippers, I think it would be more of a talent thing. OKC,
Mhm.
more of a hunger thing. And then Minnesota, more of like a roster construction thing. Because Minnesota, they're not great offensively, they're just really good defensively. But
Mhm.
when Boston does come up against a team that's pretty good on offense, they seem to struggle. And then also when they come up against a team that's pretty good on defense, they seem to struggle. So I feel like with Boston, it's all about finding the middle ground. And this team is kind of known for flameouts, especially considering the personnel that they still have. Not much has changed. They have gotten rid of a couple of guys and they brought in some
Mhm.
new guys, but at the core, Jason Tatum, he's known to have disappeared at times. Same with Jaylen Brown as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see them kind of crumble in the playoffs, or even say if they do go to the finals, like if they crumble there. But even like looking at other teams in the East, like I don't think Milwaukee would beat a lot of teams in a 7 game series in the West. New York, definitely not. Cleveland, like I just feel like if you look at the West, the top teams in there are just better. Simple as that. I think they're better equipped to win titles, and that's why we see that the West is so competitive.
Yeah, I will say, Boston is 22-3 at home.
Sure.
Right, so they've only lost 3 games at home, and they have the best record in the NBA.
Sure.
Um, so as long as that continues, that will be an advantage for them. But then, like we saw in the postseason last year, right, like they had home court advantage against the Heat. Didn't really matter at all, right? They lost the first 2 games at home. I know they came back, from 3-0 whatever, but then they lost game 7 at home. So, like, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I do like, and that was funny because that was my team that I picked to win the title going into the season.
Yeah.
And again, they've still been very good. It's just like, but again, like at the same time, it's such a small sample size. But I don't know. Like you said, the main core is still the same in terms of Tatum and Brown. And so the question is, can those guys, in the playoffs, will they be able to elevate enough to push that team over the top? Because we've seen them be able to make deep playoff runs, right? I know you mentioned flameouts, right? Like, obviously they've gotten to the finals,
Yeah.
at a relatively young age. So that's obviously quite an accomplishment,
Yes.
for sure. But then they've also had some other, like last year was pretty bad, right? I know they got to the conference finals. They should not have lost that series. And we know that, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously the Heat, you give them a ton of credit. They played great. Um, again, I mean, I still remember when they went up 3-0, we had a podcast talking about what the Celtics would need to do in the offseason.
Yeah.
And then they actually, in a funny way, literally did what we said they should do in the offseason, where they
Exactly.
moved a lot of guys that were there, right? They moved Robert Williams, they moved Marcus Smart. We said, like, yeah, they should probably do that. So they did
Yeah.
what we said they should do. And it's made a difference because they are very good. They
Yes, they
have the
are.
best point differential in the NBA. So that, makes, so obviously they are formidable, but I do kind of want to see what happens in the postseason because I do feel like at times, there's been some strange, things from this team. But again, when you've lost like 11, 12 games, like, can you really complain a whole lot? Not
Yeah.
really. And
They're a
like
great
they've
team.
had exactly. So I'm just kind of throwing it out there because it is a pattern that I've noticed, like, in some of the game, again, the handful of games that they've lost.
Yeah, I mean, you got to look at who they've lost to,
Yeah.
like you were saying. They've lost to Indiana, they've lost to Golden State, they've lost to OKC, they've lost to
Yeah.
Indiana twice, Milwaukee, Denver. These are teams that are pretty good on offense, and then some of them are pretty good on defense. So, and even in the beginning of the season, like they lost to Minnesota, they lost to I think it was Philly as well. So, it is kind of interesting to see what teams they did actually end up taking the L to.
Right. So we'll see, but it is something to point out because again, we're getting close, and I guess now I guess we'll kind of like we're a week away from the trade deadline, so now we're starting to kind of get to crunch time at this point where it's like what's gonna happen, I mean we've talked about it a lot where I think we've kind of gone a little bit back and forth in terms of what we expect. I think we still believe that there will be trades. I don't necessarily know if there's gonna be like any like major bombshell trades. I feel like there's usually almost always one.
Hmm.
Um, but there's a lot of people that are saying it's not necessarily going to happen, that it may not happen. But again, it's a week away. But we're going to just, briefly touch on one, that did happen also today before we went on and recorded. And that was Steven Adams going to the Houston Rockets. Didn't really expect that at all. I know Houston had come up. I think there was an article that had come up from The Athletic recently, right, that mentioned like that Houston is looking for, some potential big trades to make, because Ime Udoka, right, the coach for Houston, he's got a decent amount of say, right, in terms of like the roster and, the types of guys he wants on his roster. He's pushing for them to maybe go out and get a star. He also would like, for them to, get some tough guys. But one of their trade chips, right? It was Oladipo, right? It was Victor Oladipo and 3 second-round picks, that are going to the Grizzlies, right? And Steven Adams is going to the Rockets. Obviously, he's not going to play this season, right? Because obviously he was listed as out for the season before it began because he had surgery on his knee. But obviously he could help them out next season, even though he'll be a little bit older. So I think that's kind of, what they were looking for, right? Because they had mentioned names like Andre Drummond, and other guys like that, right? Just like these big, I think Capella was another one, right? Like these big guys that could play like a backup center role just to give them some more shot blocking and rebounding behind, Şengün, off the bench, which makes a lot of sense. I don't necessarily know if they're going to be able to trade for a star. I guess if you were to do that, you'd probably have to ship out like Jalen Green, which I think was something that has been mentioned, is something that Houston could do. Not that they will do it, but he's been kind of up and down this season. He's played very well as of late.
Yeah.
So maybe a showcase, for his talents. I don't know, but regardless, um, I don't know. I mean, like I said, it makes sense for both teams, right? They mentioned with the Grizzlies, it frees up, some cap flexibility because I think Oladipo is an expiring contract. Um, so that obviously helps, right? And it will allow, the Grizzlies, to potentially add, something else, right? Because you could, you know, uh, use, the lottery pick that they're going to have, right, in the draft, right, to trade for somebody, or they could just draft, some possible young guy or whatever. So, it's fine. It's not like a earth-shattering trade. Um, but again, it makes a lot of sense. Because with the Grizzlies, right, it drops them, below, that second apron or whatever, which is what you want to do. Especially for a year like this where you don't really have much of a chance of doing anything. Although they've been, okay, I guess, right? Since Ja's been out, obviously they're still not gonna, matter this season, but still, right? Like, they have 18 wins. Um,
Yeah, it's not been
so
abysmal.
yeah,
Could be
but it's
worse.
not been great.
No.
Yeah, it's not been great. But regardless, so Adams I think can help them out next year. Because again, he's a big physical guy. He's a veteran, right? That a lot of guys have liked on their teams. So that's nice. There's not a whole lot to say in the realm of this season. But what do you think about the idea of Houston trading for, a potential like star type guy? Now, I don't even know if they can really get it because again, maybe they can if they trade Jalen Green. But like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you see a scenario where it's like, oh, we could trade, like Green and then like I don't know, well, Landale or whatever, and maybe like a couple other like young guys that don't really play a whole lot, and maybe another pick or something. Like, do you think they should do that? I mean, because with Houston, right, this year they don't even have their own pick, so it
Yeah.
doesn't really benefit them to miss the playoffs. And if it makes you better, you can do it. Obviously, sometimes there is such a thing as going too quickly, but at the same time, I don't know. I mean, like, I don't really have like a huge issue with it. It kind of depends on who you're giving up.
Yeah.
I mean, like, do you feel like it's time to move on from Jalen Green? Like, do you think he should get another chance, or like, what do you think?
I
Like,
mean,
he's definitely not untouchable. I'm just saying, like,
yeah.
if you're Houston, do you think if you could have an opportunity to get it done at the deadline, would you actually do it?
I mean, yeah, he's in what, year 3
Mhm,
already, and there hasn't really been too much improvement from last year, and even in my opinion, the year before that. So, I mean, like,
mhm,
I wouldn't be opposed to moving on from him, but I feel like you should kind of walk that line with a decent amount of caution because I think he is a player that has tremendous upside.
mhm.
But at the same time, you can't ignore the glaring issues where the guy is very, very inefficient at times, and lacks sometimes, I think, basketball IQ. But you can't really hate on that too much when you have amazing athleticism and whatnot. So it wouldn't surprise me if they do move on from him. But like I said, I would walk that line with a lot of caution. But I think
Mhm.
Houston does have a lot of flexibility here
Yeah.
because they have a lot of pieces that I think a lot of teams would probably like. Jock Lando, I think, is a guy like you were saying. They even have vets like Jeff Green, I guess, and now Steven Adams. It's like they're acquiring guys. I guess
Yeah.
that's the best way to really
Yeah.
explain it. And then as for the move that they made today, I mean, I've seen on Twitter people calling it glass for glass. I guess you could call it that. But with Steven Adams, the thing is, he's been very injury prone in the last few seasons. He'll be
Mhm.
turning, I think, 31 next season or something like that. So the age is
Wow.
yeah, he's getting up there. So
No, I'm saying like wow, as in like he like it feels like he's been in the league forever and he's only like 30, 31.
yeah, so
That's just
he
kind of wild.
Yeah, so he's gonna be
Yeah.
getting up there soon, but
Yeah.
regardless, I think this is more of a financial business
Mhm,
move kind of deal for both teams because if you're
mhm.
Memphis, if he gets injured again, is there really even a point in keeping him around? I think that was their thought process. And then with Oladipo, it's another guy who has some severe injury history. Who
Yeah.
knows what his career would have been like if he didn't suffer that insane injury in Indiana, I believe. So,
Yeah.
there are some questions, but I mean, like you said, the Rockets, they get a backup big to help
Mhm.
Şengün because I mean that
Next
guy,
year.
yeah, he can't really guard anything in my opinion. It's tough to watch Şengün on defense, but
Mhm.
and then also Grizzlies can get the picks. I think they're all what second round picks, so then that
Yeah.
adds to the soft rebuild, I guess, if you want to call it that. I don't know, because it all depends on their direction and where they
Well,
want to go.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, we'll
But
see.
they do
But
get off of Adams' contract. I think that was the main
yeah,
thing that they want to do. And like you're saying,
right.
both teams are probably likely to look for somebody
Mhm.
come next year or in the off season. But none of this
Yeah,
stuff impacts them this season for sure. I don't think
right.
so.
Yeah, Aquaman landing in Houston. So
Yeah, Aquaman. His
yeah.
movie was
So
garbage, the second one, but
yeah, I
regardless,
hadn't seen it.
it's
I
garbage.
didn't want to,
Yeah,
but
nobody does.
yeah. So yeah. So I guess and then I guess if you want to touch on this funny thing, do you want to
What's
touch
up?
on the LOL hourglass thing, or do you just kind of
I
want to
don't
move
even.
on to like?
What is that? You gotta give me
So
hip.
okay, so I guess so there were two tweets, right, sent out by
Okay.
two Lakers, right? So you
Okay.
had, LeBron who sent out the hourglass. I believe that was after the Hawks game,
Okay.
where they lost, in pretty rough fashion because again, we the last time we were here, right, we had talked about, their win over Golden State and then, whether or not that was a turning point, and then they proceeded to get blown out by the Hawks and
Yeah.
whatever the other team was,
Right.
Houston, right? And then somehow won against the Celtics without LeBron and AD. Don't
Makes no
understand that.
sense.
But regardless, yeah. So after that game, right, LeBron, he tweeted out, just an hourglass emoji. And I know, like, in the post game, locker room stuff, he was talking about, like, yeah, guys just need to do their jobs or whatever.
Okay.
And we know the situation going on in there with Ham,
Sure.
and everything else, right?
Yeah.
We've talked about that, multiple times,
Yeah.
in terms of, the vibes not being all that amazing over there, for honestly, somewhat fair reasons.
Yeah. I
But
think it's
and then
warranted.
and then the Christian Wood one, right?
Okay,
But that
that's
was
who it was.
before the Hawk. That was before the Hawks game. He tweeted out "LOL" right, like right as they sent out the starting lineup because he
Right.
wasn't a part of it. It was Jackson Hayes, right?
Right.
Who was starting ahead of him. Who hadn't really been a part of the rotation, since I guess what the in-season tournament
Yeah.
or whatever.
He started against
Um,
the Celtics too, right?
yeah, and he actually played very well. In the minutes. Yeah, that was probably his best game I've
A
ever seen
Laker.
him play. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've ever seen him play. So regardless, yeah. So I guess, and then I think after the game, right, he mentioned, because they asked him about it, and he was like, "Yeah, I meant to quote tweet something, but I
Oh yeah,
didn't."
right. Yeah, right,
Quote
buddy.
Yeah, so yeah, I've used X multiple times,
Same.
for a while. I don't tweet out, but I've used it and
Sure.
I know the features in there, right? Like tweeting and retweeting, those two buttons are a little ways away from each other.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, he's got big hands, he's a big dude, so maybe that, might make a difference, but regardless,
Not big
it's not
enough.
something.
Pause. But geez. But yeah. No. 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 I don't care,
Yeah,
dude. That was intentional. He knew what he was doing. I know what situation you're talking about now. Because at first I
right.
was like, LOL. I was like, wait, what? I was like, oh,
Yeah.
Christian Wood.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, not great.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Horrible, actually.
it
I mean, if you're
so
airing out and beefing kind of and throwing subliminal shots on Twitter, and you guys are supposed to be on an NBA team together, and this is your coach, and he's talking. I mean, that I think tells you enough about the situation in LA. I don't think it's very good, and I think Ham
mm,
is on his way out potentially, but also like there's other guys on the team where it's like you don't feel too good about Christian Wood sometimes.
right.
You don't feel good about some other guys, but hey, it is what it is. I think their locker room is in pretty much shambles right now, and I think that pretty much eliminates them from any talks of like playoff anything. You know what I mean? Because if you
Yeah.
don't have
I mean,
chemistry, you ain't winning anything.
I guess I'm so curious as to like this game compared to like the other games, right? Because I saw most of this game, and I'm just like, the energy and the effort was not there. That we saw in this game was not there, right? In the last couple of games, right? Like,
Sure.
I mean, like, I guess the energy level, will wane from game to game, and it just kind of depends on who's playing, and who's there, because you don't expect LeBron and AD, to play hard or whatever every game.
Sure.
But then it's like, like where, this type of effort in this Boston game, if this was relatively consistent, you probably would be doing better than 500 because there's a lot of games where it's like, they had enough guys to win, right? Like I think they had enough guys to beat Atlanta. I guess if you have enough guys to beat this fully healthy Boston team, you should have enough to beat, the Hawks. But
Agreed.
Yeah, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I do, and again, I don't think Ham will be fired anytime soon. Because like they've, I guess, quote unquote, won enough where it's like unless they lost like 6, 7, 8, you know, games in a row, because they're like ninth, right? So like if they were like 12, 13, like last year, and they were like in that Warriors Grizzlies spot where it's like, okay, you need to win like a decent stretch of games to get back to that spot. That'd be one thing. But like, I don't know. It's just so like weird. But like,
Yeah,
it just seems so odd because from the in-season tournament to now, it's like a completely different team, right? Because we liked what we saw like from the in-season tournament.
yeah, I felt good about
Coming
that.
out of it. Yeah, like yeah, exactly. And like, but then like since then it's been kind of poopy, kind of stinky. Like
Yeah,
it's
it's
been
been doo doo. It's been horrible, like
yeah.
actually
So
bad.
right. So I do kind of wonder, you know, what what goes on like in the everyday locker room stuff in there, because it's just kind of weird to see, because again, like this type of game I wouldn't expect to happen with the situation that's been going on as of late, right?
Right.
Like maybe they're responding to what LeBron said, because obviously if you've watched him, he's been very angry in some of these games. I mean, like I know in the Hawks game, there was like a possession that kind of summed up the game where like he was running back and he got a chase down, but nobody else was back with him. So the other Hawk picked up the
Yeah,
ball
and then
and
dunked
got it
it.
dunked.
Yeah, like
Yeah, and then there
stupid.
was like I think in the Houston game, there was a possession where I think it was like Rui, where like they didn't get, where like they missed a shot. They had an opportunity to track down the long offensive rebound. He didn't even move, and then I think it was Cam Whitmore who just like raced down the floor and then got a fast break dunk like it
Yeah,
was 2K. Like it
yeah,
literally looked like a stretch of 2K possessions, right? Like in 2K how a team can like run down the floor and it's like turnover 3, turnover
yes,
dunk,
easily.
turnover. Like
That's
it
the
was like
script.
that.
That's the script.
Yeah, exactly. It's a literal script. So yeah, kind of random, but just kind of wanted to throw that out there because I know it's a discussion that a lot of people have had. I know some people have had it like towards the beginning part of their discussions, but we hadn't discussed some of those other situations. And again, we had some that had just happened today,
Yeah,
an hour or two before we recorded. So
yeah,
it kind of like in a way, we had to adjust our discussions.
yeah.
Um,
And that's kind of how the month
but
of
now,
January and February kind of go. Like where you'll have like all
right?
this random stuff kind of coming up.
Yes.
The pre trade deadline trades that happen,
Yeah.
and then also unfortunately the injuries, and then also the All Star stuff,
Right.
and then also this is all. This is clearly the time when people start to show their frustration and sometimes their true
Yeah.
colors on Twitter. So
Right.
love to see it.
Yeah. Yeah, like we had, in terms of injuries, not on the same level, right? But like Jared Vanderbilt, he got hurt in this
Right,
game where
right.
he, like had some type of weird foot injury where like you weren't sure what it was, and like he wasn't able to finish the game. So who knows what's going on with him? But
Right.
like you said, this is the weird part of the season where like you said, injuries pile up. Some teams like basically, I don't want to say quit, but like they're kind of like in a stretch where it's like, yeah, we'll see what happens next year. Like
Yeah.
the teams towards the bottom. Although Detroit's won a couple of games as of late, but still. And then like you said, you have the trade stuff. So
Yeah.
always a funny time in the NBA.
For
Even
sure.
though we had a couple of stories that were not funny at all.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
um, but now I guess we'll kind of close it out with the news and rumors. So, according to the Athletic, right? Dubs unlikely to deal big name. I mean, it mentioned they're probably not going to trade Clay or Draymond, which we already knew, right? Like I don't think that's going to happen. I know there have been times where they said like, yeah, we might think about it
Mm-hmm.
in terms of Clay, but I don't expect it. I think if they do something, it will probably be like a Chris Paul or like even a Wiggins. Because like Kaminga, you almost feel like maybe has played at a level where like they probably shouldn't trade him unless like a big time guy's available, which it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't seem like is the case. Or at the very least, like the guys that are available, I don't think makes a lot of sense for them. Like I think DeJounte Murray's been a name that's been mentioned as a possible Warrior target, but I don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Personally to me,
I don't like that
but
either.
yeah, but regardless, yeah, that's what I think. And I think they're another team where you kind of wonder what they do, by the trade deadline because they're in a weird spot, right? Where it's like, they're in. If you look at the standings, right, they are what 12th. And again, they're in this weird spot where like you're gonna have to win a few games in order to catch up, right? Because
Yeah.
12, does not equal 10. You got to at least get to 10. And the teams around them have kind of lost, some stretches, right? So it's not like they're way out of it, right? I think they're like a game or two behind all the other teams ahead of them. Because all the losses are about the same, right? Like they've played fewer games, but they have about the same amount of losses, right? Like I think they have 24 losses, and then like the Lakers, the Jazz, and the Rockets all have 25,
Yes.
but their records are, a little better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they do have a chance, to pick up a couple of wins, I think, before the deadline, right? Like they play the Grizzlies, the Hawks, the Nets, and then the Sixers without Joel Embiid.
Right.
Like, so you should probably win at least like, half of those games. You know what I
I
mean?
wouldn't put it past
Like,
them if they lose, though. Like that would not
I
surprise me if
know.
they drop a bunch
No,
of
I
them.
know. Yeah, no, I know. And, again, and then, the funny thing with the Nets is like, Ben Simmons, right? He returned.
Oh yeah.
He had that random game. What was it? I think it was against the Jazz, right? Where he had, you know, almost a triple double. It was like 10, 8, and 11, 5 of 5 from the field, and then he missed the next game.
Yep.
So, that's the rough part for him. Hopefully he can play. I think he's supposed to play Saturday. And then the Nets don't play again until Monday against the Warriors. So hopefully he can kind of actually come back and be healthy because, for that one game, I know it was just the Jazz, but for that one game, he looked pretty good
Mm-hmm.
and he helped, the Nets in a big way, right? Because they don't have like a lot of like natural playmakers,
Yeah.
on that team. It's a lot of guys that are more so like secondary playmakers and or scorers,
Yeah,
right?
like
Like,
Dinwiddie, Bridges. So
yeah,
yeah, I get you. And Cam
yeah.
Thomas, who
So that
doesn't even pass, so that
right.
hey, it is what it is.
So yeah, so that's something to kind of think about. Not again, maybe it may not make that much of a difference because I still don't think the Nets are that great of a team, and their team also is a team that could look a little different, right? By the deadline, right? Because they've been tied, into a decent number of rumors, right? Like what was it, like Dorian Finney-Smith, Spencer Dinwiddie, Royce O'Neal, right? They've been tied, to a handful of teams, so like teams like LA or whatever. So their team could look a little bit different as well. Or maybe guys might be flipped, to other teams or whatever. So,
Yeah, I don't
but even
know. I don't know if this is in like the rumors list that you compiled, but I did hear that like I think it was Brooklyn turned down the Houston Rockets offer for
yeah,
Bridges.
yep, that was there.
Okay,
Yep.
sorry, didn't mean to spoil that, but you can go ahead and talk about that whenever you want.
Yeah, and like you said, right? Houston they rejected, or excuse me, the Nets rejected, the offer for Mikal Bridges, which I think makes sense. I mean, because again, it's like it was a decent amount of picks, but at the same time, like if you're the Nets, right? Like there's no real point in doing that, right? I think he's at a level where you'd probably like a decent player.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe an additional picks. And also, like, if you're the Nets, like, you probably want to keep him, right?
Yeah,
Now, if it's a Godfather offer or like a really good offer, like, he's not untouchable. You know what I mean?
agreed.
So, like, if there's like a really, really good offer, then you do it. I feel like there are offers that could be given from other teams that may be better. But you just never know, right? Like, because then the Nets, you never know, could settle and then send him to some lesser team, or not lesser team, but like a team that may not have quite as many assets,
Sure.
and then they just take that, which you hope you don't do if you're the Nets, but um, yeah, I don't know, and like, but again, that kind of ties into the idea of Houston is clearly chasing, for another star, and if you get a guy like Bridges that could help, I feel like they probably need like a guy that you can rely on, like to score, and kind of like close out games offensively, because I
Yeah.
think they have a lot of like really solid, not utility guys, but like, really solid players within like the system or the team. But you don't really have a guy that you feel great about like going to late in games, other than I guess kind of Shengun. But he's a center, and that's a little bit different than
It's
like
limited.
a guard or yeah, than a guard or a wing. Even though he can play downhill and play with the ball because he's a post scorer or whatever, but still, I think you'd like somebody from the perimeter who could also create as well. And I think that's probably the type of guy, like a little more so than like a Bridges. You know what I mean? But at the same time, you probably don't have quite enough to like get somebody much better. So maybe it could be that guy. But I feel like you might want somebody who's like a little bit better as like a self creator. Not that he can't self create because he is good at it, but I
Yeah.
just feel like there's probably like a better version. And
Agreed.
then it looks like, yeah. And it looks like Shams, he just put out to clarify an earlier tweet, the team has not officially confirmed a tear and says that Joel Embiid or Embiid, okay, or I guess he spelled it with a C. Yeah, he spelled it with a C, will remain out through the weekend while a treatment plan is finalized. So
Okay.
they haven't confirmed that he has a torn meniscus. So that's I guess a good sign. If it's not fully torn, then that means he may not be out as long. So that's nice. Um, so just kind of interesting because again, we talked about that where it was odd how like You had two sources that said it wasn't torn. They just said it was injured. And then you had Shams who said it was torn. So,
Yeah. And that's the tricky
yeah.
thing. So you just got to
Yeah.
wait and see. I feel like
Yeah.
this could be a
Shams
potential
is gonna
good
have to
thing.
take the L on that.
Yeah.
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 Shams is gonna have to take the L on that one. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. And then Kuzma asking price overblown. So so yeah, so
Great.
basically I guess so that means that they're not asking for a crazy like 2 first rounders according to the Athletic. So I mean, to be honest, I don't feel like he's gonna like anybody's gonna trade 2 first rounders to get him. You know
No.
what I mean? Because I think he's good, but I also don't see him as like, yeah, we should give up. I mean, like, who are the guys that we've seen go for multiple 1st rounders, right? Like, I mean, we've seen them a couple right in like the last year or two, but that was the last year or two, right? As of late, the more recent trades, like Siakam went for 3 first rounders, but like most of those are not going to be all that great, anyways. But like Siakam is better than Kuzma, and then OG Anunoby, they didn't even give up any first. Now, in fairness, that was because they gave up, some younger guys like Barrett, and quickly, but still, yeah, and that's going to be the interesting thing about the deadline is somebody's going to have to crack, right? Because somebody's going to have to decide like either the buyers are going to have to, give up more or the sellers are going to have to ask for less, right? And that's something that that's going to be really intriguing to find out as we get closer to the deadline cuz, you know, again, say like a Tyus Jones. I like Tyus Jones. He's not a guy I would give up multiple 1st rounders for. I don't even know if I would do one. So,
Yeah. I wouldn't give up a first round pick for Tyus Jones either, and not two for Kyle Kuzma, especially after the game that I saw like against the
okay.
Clippers. I was like, yeah, no. Because I mean, come on now, Kyle Kuzma had 0 assists. That in my opinion is unacceptable. I know that he's not the greatest playmaker or anything like that, but and I do love Kuz, and I think he's a great
Yeah.
player. I just don't think he's worth that value, but. Yeah, my goodness gracious. It really pains me to talk about the Wizards like anytime
Mm.
because they're just that bad. And I feel like there are
What
some guys that can like, be moved for some decent picks and assets
mm.
and pieces, I guess, but ain't much.
What if he was the injury replacement?
Kuz?
Yeah.
There's no shot that he is. If he was, I'd be like, all right, cool. But at the same time, I'd be like, does he really deserve that? Not really. I mean, what are his numbers looking like this season? So he's averaging
Isn't it like
22, 6, and
yeah.
4 on 45%. It's like,
Yeah, but
okay,
for a
but you're
9
doing
win.
that.
Yeah,
You're
but
doing that
but
on the
then for a
9
9-win
win
team.
team. You're doing that for the
So
Washington Wizards. It's like, all right. Like, and I love Kuz to death. I really do. But,
somebody's
you know,
gotta do it. So, I mean,
yeah.
somebody's gotta do that for the Wizards. I mean, like, like,
Yeah.
I know people will mention, like, putting up stats on a bad team, and I get it, but, like, you still have to have some level of talent to do it. Like,
For
I
sure.
mean, I know, like, people will say, like, "Well, yeah, you could just put anybody, on a team, and if you give them enough minutes and enough shots, like, they could get to 20." And, like, there is some truth to that because a lot of these NBA guys are good. Even the guys that, like, don't get as many minutes are still better than you think, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like regardless of whether or not they're at the NBA. Obviously, if they're not at the NBA and they're just like playing in a pickup game, they will destroy you.
Oh, for
But
sure.
um, but still, like that is something that would be interesting. I kind of just threw that out there as like a
Yeah,
laugh
yeah,
thing. Just,
yeah. I
but I
got you.
mean, again, it's possible. He got All Star votes from fans,
Yeah.
which so that
I,
counts for
I
something.
mean, I feel like he's always been a fan favorite because he's got the Laker loyals who are like
Yeah.
who still really love him, and then
Right.
obviously the
Yeah.
Wizards player or Wizards fans also are obviously going to vote their best player in as well. So I get it, and like Jordan Poole didn't really step up to the plate. I feel like he could have potentially capitalized on his opportunity this season to be the best player on the team. That didn't really work, and then like you were saying with Tyus Jones, I feel like there is some sort of value because he does have a very good assist to turnover ratio, but there's just times where you're like, he's not really a
He's
starting
not a
point
starter.
guard. No, he's
He's not
not
a
a starting point guard. He does shoot well from the three and stuff like that, but the volume of shots that he takes is just not at a starting caliber, I think. So
starter.
that's kind of where I
Yeah.
stand on the Wizards guys.
Yeah. And then I guess another question is, so what do you think of like this situation where they're talking about like with the Knicks, say like a Clarkson guys like Clarkson and Olynyk from the Jazz. What do you think about that from the Knicks? Because it's like it's kind of interesting because like Clarkson identity wise is pretty different I think, from like a lot of the other Knicks players that they have right now.
Okay.
But he also does, in a way, like fill, a need that they probably have, where it's like, can you find like another perimeter type scorer?
Right.
Because it's like, you have Brunson really is the only lone perimeter scorer,
Yeah.
because like Randall is, like a front court guy.
Sure.
And then everyone else is more so like they'll spot up, they'll attack a closeout, but you're not really like, asking them to like, be a scorer. I mean,
Yeah.
Anunoby, like he can put up points, but I don't know if I would really call him a scorer. Um, but that's what Clarkson does. And like, again, those type of guys, in the postseason are kind of interesting, right? Because, a lot of times like their offense has kind of a ceiling.
Hmm.
And then like, then some of their other weaknesses get kind of targeted. Like he's not alone, right? We've talked about
Yeah.
this, for a while, right? Like, again, like a lot of guards have that issue. And if they're not like an all-star or better, like that's gonna be a problem. But has played pretty well, the last few seasons for Utah. And you do kind of wonder, like, he's on what, like a 2-3 year deal or whatever. So it's not like last year where he's like in the last year of his deal. And it's not like a crazy amount of money. So like, I mean, I guess the thought process is from the Knicks, you got to find a replacement for the Fournier contract. If you can turn that into a rotational piece, one or two, like either one good one or two solid ones, then you're in a really good spot. Because we already talked about they are the 2 seed. And if they can get, swing something like that, it may not necessarily have to be that. They have some room to grow. But what do you think about that?
You know what's funny? I think I had mentioned that on the last episode about Utah and the Knicks doing some sort of move at the deadline, and I would definitely be all on board for them
Right.
getting, either whether it be Colin Sexton or Jordan Clarkson. I think both of those guys would be amazing. And like you were saying, Kelly Olynyk, I think that's also a smart thing to do as well, since Mitchell Robinson is going to be out as for I think what is it, the season?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So
I think with that situation, it was strange because they applied for the disabled player exception and they didn't get it
okay,
because there's a possibility he could be back, but we
okay,
don't know, if he'll actually be back. But he's not like officially ruled out for the season. But
okay.
even if he comes back, it probably won't be until very, very late, which makes sense why you're targeting extra big man depth because it's basically Hartenstein and Achua and then Jericho Sims. Like that's
Yeah,
it.
that's not a great front court if you want me to be honest. That's not a good center rotation. But
Especially with Randall out.
yeah,
Especially with Randall out.
exactly. So I think that would be smart for them to come up with some sort of package. And the intriguing thing is they kind of already had a budget version of Jordan Clarkson in the past with IQ, quickly. So it would be kind of interesting to see them get a player back who is somewhat like Quickly. And I think Quickly fit into their system very well at times. There are times when he could just light up the court. So it would be intriguing for, I guess, them to go after a guy like Clarkson. I wouldn't be opposed to that at all.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, the Knicks, they've kind of arrived now. Obviously, the Randall trade or excuse me, the Randall injury, right? That hurts
Yeah.
big time. But like, they've been really impressive, I think,
Yeah, they've
as
been
of late, and I
fire.
think they're definitely a team, to watch. Is like if they, add a few more rotational pieces. I'm not saying that they're gonna come out of the East and win a championship, but you feel a lot better about what they could do. Like could they make a conference finals run, especially with this potential weird Philly situation? Yeah, they
Right.
could.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think they're going to take advantage of the opportunity for sure.
yeah, and they should. And then according to the Athletic, Bulls unlikely to make major move. Chicago not expected to make big trade at deadline amid Zach Levine buzz. Yeah, that's kind of something
Figured.
that I've thought about. Where like we talked about it, right? Where we said it was probably going to be very difficult for Levine to get moved, and it's not because he's a bad player. It's not because he's a bad individual. It's that contract where when you make that much, again, we've talked about it many times. You got to give up a lot to get those type of guys, and well, to get those type of contracts. And he doesn't necessarily lift the team up individually enough to feel like it's worth it. And most teams don't have like $40 million or like 30 whatever, in terms of like nothing on their salary books.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
especially contenders, right? Most of the contenders they're using a good chunk of their salary on, the guys that are on the team, right? Like the Celtics don't have a lot of dead weight in terms of salary on their roster, right?
No.
Same with like the Nuggets or I guess Minnesota or something like that. Maybe they have guys that they could swap out, but not 40 million worth.
Right.
So
Yeah, and that's the
that's
tough part. Yeah. It's just it's I don't think you can really move him at this
right.
point. That's the problem.
Yeah. And I do kind of wonder, like now, like, do you even potentially like, will they even move like a DeRozan? Because again, like in
I
fairness
don't
to the
think
Bulls,
so.
they've played a lot better as of late. So you kind of wonder, like, are they going to just be like, yeah, we'll just try to make the play in now? Because they're like, they're ninth in the Eastern Conference. There are a few games back, of 8. So, probably like 8 is their ceiling, depending on what happens with like the Heat and the Magic. Um, but either way, it seems like they're definitely playing bound. I don't think they're gonna completely drop out of it, but we'll see, because again, also you have the Nets, right? They're still kind of in there hanging around. Although, depending on what they do, they may bottom out, which is gonna be rough for them because they don't have their own pick. I don't believe so. That's gonna be brutal. But, regardless, like it's a race, and I think for the Bulls, if you don't find anything good, like you might have to do it. It's just a matter of like, are you gonna be able to re-sign DeRozan? Maybe I guess they could. Because again, I don't think a ton of teams will have cap. Some will, but
Right.
like but most of them are like teams that aren't that great. Like if you're the Pistons, are you actually going to sign DeMar DeRozan to like a big deal? Like I mean, unless it's like 1 or 2 years, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Um, and what was it? Toronto, I think, is another team with cap. I guess you could bring him back and do a reunion, but like I don't
Does
know.
that
Does
make a
that make
lot
a
of
lot of
sense
sense?
though? No, no,
Yeah,
no, no,
yeah,
no.
no, it doesn't make a lot of
No.
sense. So that's
That
my point.
that would
So
just be
I don't know.
for giggles. Like, what would be the point
Yeah.
of that?
Yeah, so
What?
they may just be stuck in a weirdo situation.
Yeah.
But regardless, yeah. And then then like you look at the Miami Heat,
Hmm.
um, and I guess, in terms of the stuff going on, with them, right? I guess um like, what do they do? Like, because I mean, like, they've already, made the move for Rozier. I know, they had a meeting, right? I think it was, I think Jimmy and Bam, it was reported that they spoke up, in a Heat meeting because they lost 7 in a row before they won that Kings game because, they had been pretty bad as of late.
Yeah.
So, you know, I guess we can kind of check in, on that Rozier deal, right? Like, he's played okay, I guess,
Yeah.
right? He hasn't played great. Again, very small sample size, but it still feels like, you're still gonna have some problems where it's like, your backcourt is not great defensively. And then you still also have to factor in like, he's averaging 10 points, 6 assists, 3.5 rebounds. Again, it's a 5 game sample size, so it's not like, you're, scared yet. But it just feels like, then him and Hero, it's like you don't have much defense there. You're still like a small team. So I feel like they're still gonna have to upgrade something. It's not gonna be anything major at this point, I don't think, because the big one was already Rozier, unless you move Hero. I know there have been guys online, like I think Kevin O'Connor suggested, like, yeah, maybe they should move, Tyler Hero. Like, do you think they should probably do that, or do you think like it should be like, just kind of wait and see, and maybe like just kind of like, yeah, you just lost 7 in a row, you had a meeting. Let's just kind of like give it, some time and see what happens. But you only have a week, so that's not a whole lot of time.
Yeah. And then the thing with Tyler Hero is it's kind of a similar situation to Zach Levine, where it's like, do you really want Tyler Hero when he's making that kind of money? In my opinion, I don't know
Right.
if that's a smart investment. I think Miami is fine with keeping him. I think they should keep him because I don't think he's played horrible or anything like that. I think he does have a decent amount of value. He's averaging like what 20 something, and then on like 43% from the field. That's the only issue. But he takes a
Mhm.
decent amount of threes. But regardless, I think that you should probably just keep Tyler Hero. That's one of those things where like you're not going to get a lot in return, and I don't think there's going to be
Right.
a lot of
Yeah.
interest in him as well. That would be the
Right.
only other thing.
And I know, I think Kendrick Perkins was like they should trade Jimmy Butler. I don't think that's gonna happen. I
That
mean,
guy, I don't know. Sometimes that guy does stuff for for views. Like I think we all know that. And Jimmy
but
Butler's not going anywhere.
no, I don't think so. And if
Yeah,
he does, it would be because he wants out. It wouldn't be because
yeah,
like yeah, we're just gonna trade you,
yeah. Like, what would be the
you know.
point of that?
So, but yeah, but again, it's just something to keep in mind because they had a brutal stretch as of late, and
Yeah, for sure.
again, you don't want to have a stretch like that, but again, you can always make up for it potentially if you have a strong stretch over the next few weeks. Um, but it's something to look at.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I mean, like now, I guess, and we're pretty much done, with the rumors, but we're a week away from the trade deadline. So I guess, kind of once again to reiterate, like, what are you expecting? Because again, we've heard a lot of different takes, right? At times we've heard that there will be a decent amount of action. We've also heard as of late that like the action has kind of slowed down a little bit. Um, So, it's kind of hard sometimes to figure out, and like sift through what's true and what's not
Mhm.
because there's so much information out there, especially how it's covered now. But just in general, like, what are you expecting? Because I don't know. I still am like kind of holding out that like there's going to be more action than we expect. Like, I'm not saying a superstar trade is going to happen, but I'm still kind of holding out that like we're going to see a little bit more movement than what has been said as of late. Because I just feel like at a certain point, some of those sellers will come down in terms of like their asking prices a little bit.
Mhm.
Not all of them should be in a rush to move pieces because like some of them are on multi-year deals or whatever. But I don't know. I just can't imagine like a team is going to be like, yeah, let's give up multiple first to give up, to get the guys, some of the guys that we mentioned.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be any superstar movement. If you want me to be pretty
Right.
honest, like I think we're going to see more deals that are in line with, say, the trade that happened as we were or before we recorded, with Steven Adams. I think we're going to see moves like that. We're probably going to see, maybe let's say Atlanta making moves, something like that. Utah probably selling on some guys. Um, and then obviously, some teams probably buying, maybe like the Lakers. I don't know. Like that's the tricky part because it seems like every
Right.
rumor that's come out has been somewhat debunked or like now people are
Right.
saying it's not going to happen. Like all this stuff has
Right.
died down. It's like, well, why'd you put it out in the first place? So that's the thing that's kind of tricky about this stuff. But I think we're going to see a lot of middle of the pack players kind of be moved around and shifted around. So I think I'm expecting a decent amount of moves, just not anything that makes my eyes pop out.
Right, yeah, because and like you said, that is kind of the fascinating thing where we've heard so many deals where it's like like you said, like Dejounte Murray, right? Where like there was stuff initially that made it seem like this is probably going to happen, and then now it's like oh, it's probably not going to happen, right? Because
Right.
like Atlanta wants Austin Reeves, and the Lakers don't want to give up Austin Reeves, so so they're looking elsewhere. So that is kind of interesting, right? Where it's like and then we've heard back and forth, say from like a Golden State, where it's like, oh, they might trade these guys, and now they're not going to trade these guys, or whatever. So and they're not the only teams involved in trade rumors. It's just like the teams at the top, we don't hear about them in trade rumors because they don't have to do as much, right? So like we know Boston doesn't have to do as much. The Nuggets don't have to do as much, right? All those teams at the top don't have a ton that they have to do because they're already really good. But those teams, like you said, that are middle of the pack or lower, they have a lot more to think about, right? Because like say the bad teams have to think about what guys should we probably get rid of to get something back for them so we can either get some assets or start our rebuild or whatever. And then, like you said, the teams in the middle of the pack are probably thinking, what can we do to make ourselves a little bit better so we can potentially, do some type of play-in run or like, just can we get to 6? Can we get to
Right.
7?
Right.
Can we
Right.
get or something like that?
Right.
Can we, can we do that kind of hooping?
Sure.
So
Can
yeah,
we
so
hoop?
that's
Yeah. No, we
yeah,
can't.
exactly. So I'm kind of with you where like yeah, I don't expect a big time superstar to get moved, but I do expect something along the lines of like yeah, there's going to be some movement in terms of teams in the middle of the pack will try to improve, teams towards the bottom will probably sell, and then teams at the top will probably do like minor moves,
Hmm.
maybe like, to get out of that second apron if they can or whatever, right? Like
Right.
we know that there's like a couple of teams that are very like we saw New Orleans, right? They were a part of that Siakam trade. They didn't get anybody back in terms of players, but they moved Kyra Lewis Jr. In order to duck the luxury tax, which makes sense,
Exactly.
right? Because
Smart
again, like
move.
they're not exactly right because you don't necessarily feel comfortable paying the luxury tax for this team, not necessarily yet.
No.
Not that they're bad at all, because they're not. They're good.
Yeah.
It's just you're not ready necessarily just yet to go into the luxury
Yeah. They haven't
tax.
proved
So
anything yet.
right, and that's where I think we'll see other teams do that as well. And then also, some teams will probably shed some guys for the buyout market because there's going to be some guys that are going to get bought out. Of course, we know we've heard those names, like we mentioned guys like potentially Kyle Lowry. Of course, there's going to be some teams that can't sign buyout guys, right? The teams that are in, the second apron, they're not going to be able to do that. So the Celtics, the Nuggets, the Warriors, the Clippers, the Heat, the Bucks, and the Suns, right? So those 7 teams cannot sign. Well, if they do sign buyout guys, it can't be guys that make more than like the mid level,
Okay.
right? So like any like kind of big name buyout guy that's not like on a minimum contract, or like something from like the minimum to like 10 million, they can't get those guys, right? So Kyle Lowry, if guys on Charlotte get bought out, like I said, like Lowry or Hayward or other guys, they can't get those guys.
Right.
So, yeah, so that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, We're a week away from the deadline, right? Next Thursday at 3 p.m. is the trade deadline. We will begin, a live stream around noon, and probably run a little after 3, right? Maybe like 15, or so minutes after, because again, there are sometimes trades that, kind of trickle in afterwards. But regardless, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We will read your comment at the beginning of the video if you do. And so we thank you for all the support, and we will see you next week.